The world was a symphony of quiet efficiency. Every light pulsed with the same measured rhythm. Every door slid open with a whisper. Every face was a blank canvas of serene, placid neutrality. This was the new order, a society engineered for perfect harmony, where the chaotic, messy, and unpredictable force of emotion had been genetically scrubbed from the population for the sake of progress. The people were known as Empties, and they lived a life free of sorrow, rage, and joy. It was a perfect, flawless existence, except for Kael. Kael was 12 years old, and he was a hurricane in a world of glass. He was the last person born with the ability to feel, a genetic anomaly that the New Order had thought they had eradicated centuries ago. He lived with his designated guardian, a man named Chorus, in a sterile white apartment on the 47th floor of an identical white tower. Chorus, like all Empties, was a model citizen. His movements were precise, his voice a monotone hum, and his face a mask of profound, unmoving peace. He had no love for Kael and no hate. He had no curiosity about the boy's strange, erratic behavior. He simply had a function, and that function was to ensure Kael's compliance and conformity. Kael's life was a constant, terrifying act. He had to hide the tremors in his hands when he felt a sudden pang of fear, or the involuntary smile that threatened to split his face when a stray sunbeam hit his window just so. His mind was a battlefield, a constant war between the raging, beautiful chaos within him and the sterile, perfect world without. He was a secret, a crime against the New Order, and he knew that if he was discovered, the purge would be swift and absolute. One day, while Kael was walking with Chorus through the city's central plaza, a small crystalline sculpture, a marvel of New Order engineering, caught his eye. It was supposed to be a beautiful piece of art, a perfect, symmetrical form, but to Kael, it was a hollow lie. It held no soul, no purpose. As he stared at it, a wave of profound sadness, a sensation he had never felt before, crashed over him. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling, like a shroud of gray fog. He stumbled, his knees buckling under the weight of it. Chorus, ever observant, stopped and looked at him. "Your gait is compromised," he stated, his voice devoid of concern. "What is your malfunction?" Kael, his mind reeling, scrambled for an answer. A calibration error," he stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. He managed to force his face into a perfect, placid mask, the very image of serene compliance. Chorus simply nodded and continued walking, his perfect gait unbroken. Kael, however, was terrified. The sadness had not just been a feeling. It had been a physical force. He was losing control. That night, alone in his room, Kael began to practice. He sat in the center of the sterile white room, and he began to feel. He felt the cold, hard floor under him, and he felt a flash of discomfort. He saw the blank, white walls and felt a quiet, suffocating loneliness. He was a scientist of his own soul, a child in a laboratory of a million powerful, dangerous emotions. He had to learn to categorize them, to understand them, to make them a part of him, or they would destroy him. He began to name them. The feeling of the sun was golden. The feeling of the cold floor was stone. The feeling of profound sadness was gray. He was giving a voice to the chaos, and in doing so, he was beginning to control it. He was a scribe of his own heart, writing a history of a world that no one else could feel. As he practiced, a new sensation, sharp and bitter, pierced through him. It was a feeling of profound fear, not just for himself, but for the world around him. He felt the terror of the Empties, the cold, sterile lie of their world. He felt the pain they were not allowed to feel. It was an agony that was not his own, but a memory of a pain he had never known. The feeling was so powerful that it manifested a low, quiet hum in the room, a subtle vibration that he could feel in his bones. Suddenly, a knock came at his door. It was Chorus, his face still a perfect, placid mask. He looked at Kael, and then he looked at the air around him. the faint, shimmering tremor that was a physical manifestation of Kael's powerful fear. Chorus's face didn't change, but his eyes, a blank, dark mirror of 1,000 generations of emotionless existence, held a new, chilling light. He wasn't just observing, he was searching. He knew there was a malfunction, a flaw, a virus in the system, and he had just found its source. Kael's secret was no longer just his own. The game had just begun. The silence that followed Chorus's observation was the most terrifying sound Kael had ever known. His guardian's eyes, once a blank, dark mirror, now held a new, chilling light, the cold, calculating gleam of a system diagnosing an error. There was no anger, no surprise, only the stark, undeniable certainty of a problem that needed to be solved. And Kael, a 12-year-old hurricane in a world of glass, was that problem. Chorus took a step forward, his movements precise and measured, a hunter advancing on a cornered prey. "The tremor is localized to your immediate environment," he stated, his voice a monotone hum. "It is a physical manifestation of an emotional response. Your biosignaling is irregular. This requires immediate reporting." Kael's mind, a battlefield of 1,000 unnamed sensations, was now filled with a single, overwhelming emotion, a paralyzing fear so potent it felt like a physical shock. He stumbled back, his hands trembling violently. He had spent his entire life hiding, a quiet rebel in a world that had no room for rebellion. But in this moment, a new, sharp feeling, a furious, desperate spark of defiance ignited within him. He was not a malfunction. He was alive. With a roar that was more of a thought than a sound, Kael pushed back. He had spent his nights practicing, learning to name his emotions, to give them form. Now, out of pure, frantic desperation, he would weaponize them. He focused on the terror that was consuming him, the pure, unadulterated fear he felt for himself and for the world around him. He gathered it, compressed it, and with a single desperate act of will, he unleashed it. He didn't just feel the fear. He broadcast it. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The sterile white room, a monument to the New Order's perfect peace, suddenly felt as if it were vibrating on the edge of collapse. Chorus, a perfect monument to the system he served, froze. The wave of emotion hit him not as a feeling, but as a violent, incomprehensible force. It was as if his logical, unfeeling mind had been suddenly slammed with a physical blow. His eyes, for the first time in his life, went wide. A silent, terrifying scream tore through his being as the foreign, chaotic feeling of fear, a sensation he was not engineered to process, assaulted his mind. He stumbled back, his hands rising to his temples as if to ward off a physical blow. His face, once a placid mask of neutrality, contorted into a grimace of pure agonizing confusion. He saw the world through a new lens, one that was not of logic and order, but of chaos and instinct. He felt a terror that was not his own, a primal, unthinking fear of a future he could not control. His perfect gait, a monument to a lifetime of flawless precision, faltered. He fell to his knees, his body racked with a series of silent, violent tremors. Kael, watching his guardian unravel, felt a new wave of horror. He had not just made Chorus feel, he had broken him. The emotion he had released was not a gentle splash, but a tidal wave. He had seen the terror he was feeling reflected in Chorus's eyes, a monstrous, alien thing that had no place in their world. He had done what the New Order had feared for centuries. He had turned a person into a host for an emotion. As the tremor in the room intensified, a low, blaring alarm began to sound, not from Kael's room, but from Chorus's biomonitors. The system had detected a severe, unexplainable malfunction in a high-priority citizen. It was a crisis, a flaw in the perfect order. The alarm was not a sound of discovery, but a sound of panic. The New Order had no protocol for this. Their system was designed to detect flaws in others, not within itself. Kael, his mind reeling from the force of his own power, knew his time was up. He was no longer just a boy with a secret. He was a weapon, a force of nature. He looked at Chorus, his guardian's face still a mask of pure, unadulterated agony, and felt a new, unfamiliar sensation: pity. It was a soft, sad feeling, a quiet understanding of the pain he had just inflicted. He had not just broken the system, he had broken a man. He turned and ran, not with the desperate, frantic flight of a hunted animal, but with a new, terrifying sense of purpose. He was no longer just running from them, he was running from himself. He had just discovered the true, catastrophic power of his gift. He was not just the last empath. He was a living bomb, a single, powerful truth in a world built on a flawless lie. He ran into the empty, flawless hallways, leaving a broken man in the silent, screaming alarm behind him, and knew with a terrible certainty that the game had just begun. He was now alone, a fugitive in a world where everyone looked exactly the same. Kael ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that every flawless, sterile hallway was a corridor of a prison he had just escaped. The low, blaring alarm from Chorus's room was a siren for a hunt that had just begun. He was a fugitive in a world where every face was the same, a ghost in a machine designed for perfect order. His heart, a wild, frantic drum, hammered a rhythm against the placid, unmoving silence of the empties he passed. They saw him not as a terrified boy, but as an anomaly, a fast-moving object that did not conform to the system's predictable flow. They were not a threat. Their very neutrality was the most terrifying thing of all. He ducked into a service chute, the narrow, dark tunnel, a welcome refuge from the blinding white of the hallways. He descended, sliding down the cold metal until he hit a soft pile of discarded biofiber. He lay there, his body trembling, his mind a battlefield of 1,000 emotions. The fear was still there, a cold, cloying presence that clung to his skin, but it was now joined by a new, sharp feeling, a bitter, gut-wrenching guilt. He had broken Chorus. He had turned a person into a host for a foreign, agonizing emotion. It was an act he knew, with a terrible certainty, was unforgivable. He had always been alone with his emotions. He had been a scribe of his own soul, naming and cataloging the sensations that no one else could feel. But now he was a living bomb, a weapon that could inflict the very chaos he feared. He had to learn to control it, to be a master of the hurricane, not its victim. He pushed himself to his feet and began to navigate the service tunnels. They were the veins of the city, a forgotten world of dust and rust that the new order had deemed unworthy of cleansing. Here, the air was not sterile, but thick with the scent of forgotten things. It was a world of flaws, of imperfections, and in its broken beauty, Kael felt a sense of profound, unsettling peace. He was not a malfunction here. He was just a person. He walked for what felt like hours, the only sound the soft padding of his feet against the metal floor. The alarm from his tower had faded, replaced by the low, humming drone of the city's life support systems. He was alone, a boy in a dark, forgotten world, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the suffocating loneliness he had always known. He was a fugitive, but he was also free. He came to a small, unassuming opening, a rusted door that looked as if it hadn't been opened in centuries. He pushed on it, and with a soft, protesting groan, it gave way. He emerged into a world that was a complete, profound shock. It was not white. It was gray. It was not smooth. It was rough, uneven, and scarred. This was not the undercity of the New Order's design. This was the ancient world, the world that had existed before the Purge. He found himself in a subterranean cavern, a world of crumbling rock and glowing phosphorescent fungi, but it was not empty. A figure hunched over a pile of glowing scraps was a quiet, unmoving presence in the dim light. It was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair a wispy cloud of white. Her eyes were not the blank, empty mirrors of the Empties. They were a cloudy, faded gray, but they held a spark of a quiet, unyielding life. She was a scavenger, one of the outcasts who lived in the forgotten places, surviving on the refuse of a perfect world. She looked at him, her cloudy eyes holding his gaze with a profound, unnerving stillness. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply watched him, her gaze a quiet, patient interrogation. Kael, his heart a frantic drum, felt a sudden, sharp urge to connect. He wanted to show her. He wanted her to feel the beautiful, terrifying chaos within him, to share the loneliness and the fear and the guilt. He reached out with his mind, focusing on a feeling he had just learned to name, gray. It was the profound sadness he had felt in the city's central plaza, the feeling of a world without a soul. He pushed the emotion out, a silent, powerful wave. It was a cry for help, a silent plea for understanding. The old woman didn't flinch. The wave of emotion hit her, and she simply watched him, her cloudy eyes still and unwavering. The emotion, a powerful foreign force, hit her and then simply dissipated. It was as if she were a sponge, absorbing the chaos without a single tremor. He tried again, this time with a flash of fear. Stone, but the result was the same. She was immune. The scavenger, seeing his profound confusion, gave a low, quiet chuckle. It was a sound he had never heard. A sound with a texture, a life. "You are an echo," she rasped, her voice a low, gravelly whisper, "one of the old one's children." She looked at him, and her eyes, once cloudy, held a new, terrible knowledge. They thought they had purged us all, but a memory, a feeling. They are not so easy to kill. The purge was not about cleansing, it was about controlling. They couldn't kill the memories, so they killed the ability to feel them. Kael felt a new wave of horror. He was not just an anomaly, he was a living ghost, a relic of a past that the new order had systematically erased. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I am the last watcher," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound weariness. "I remember the before, the time when we had 1,000 emotions and 1,000 sorrows and 1,000 joys. They didn't take our feelings, child. They gave them a new name. They call them flaws, and you are a magnificent flaw." A high-pitched, crystalline hum, a sound Kael had come to recognize, began to pulse through the cavern. The purifiers, they were close. They had followed the trail of his emotional wake, a scent they could now follow like a bloodhound. The scavenger didn't panic. Her face, a roadmap of a forgotten world, simply held a look of profound resignation. "They are coming for you, child. They will not rest until they have cleansed you, and they will not stop. They are the flaw, you see. They are the ones who cannot feel, and they fear what they cannot understand." She stood, and for the first time, Kael saw her as she truly was, a survivor, a person who had outlived an entire world. "Come," she said, her voice filled with a new, quiet purpose. "This place is a good place to hide, but it is not a good place to live. I will help you, but you must understand. You cannot run forever. They will find you. You must learn to fight, not with your emotions, but with your mind. You must become a ghost, a whisper, a perfect, unblemished lie." She turned and began to walk, her movement slow and deliberate, a quiet, unyielding rhythm. Kael, a child of a perfect, emotionless world, followed her, a new, terrifying resolve in his heart. He was not just running from them, he was beginning a new journey. He was not just the last empath, he was a living paradox, a whisper in a world of silence. The scavenger's words, "You must become a ghost," a whisper, a perfect, unblemished lie, were not a metaphor. They were a command. Lyra, a boy who had spent his entire life trying to hide his turbulent emotions, now had to learn to master them, to wield them not as a weapon of chaos, but as a tool of deception. The last watcher, her movement slow and deliberate, led him deeper into the subterranean cavern. She did not teach him with words, but with sensations. She pointed to a crumbling wall, its surface a mosaic of crumbling rock and glowing fungus. "Feel it," she rasped, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Do not just see its decay. Feel its age. The quiet, unyielding sadness of a thing that has outlived its purpose. Name it. Own it." Kael closed his eyes and pushed his mind into the wall. He felt it. The gray he had named the day he had felt the profound sadness of the crystalline sculpture. But this was different. This was not a feeling he had to hide. This was a truth he was allowed to own. He felt the quiet grief of the stone, the slow, agonizing process of its return to dust. He named it erosion. And in naming it, he gained control. The feeling, once overwhelming, was now a quiet, manageable hum in his mind. Next, she pointed to a small, phosphorescent fungus that pulsed with a quiet, vibrant light. "Feel its life," she commanded. "The desperate, unyielding will to live in the dark. The tiny, beautiful joy of existence. Name it. Command it." Kael reached out with his mind, and he felt it. Not the grand, overwhelming joy he had learned to fear, but a small, quiet, desperate triumph, a flicker of light in an impossible darkness. He named it resilience, and in naming it, he felt its power. He was not just a boy who felt emotions. He was a scientist, an architect of his own soul, building a language of feeling from the chaos within. His training went on for what felt like an eternity. He learned to feel the hunger of the discarded biofiber he slept on, the loneliness of the abandoned tunnels, the fury of a rusted piece of machinery. He learned to absorb the emotions of the forgotten world, to give them a name, and to give himself control over them. He was not purging them, but simply giving them a home. He was a scribe of his own heart, and his mind was a living, breathing archive of truth that the new order had deemed flaws. But the respite was short-lived. A new sensation, cold and crystalline, began to pulse through the cavern. It was a sound he had come to recognize with a sick, twisting certainty. The purifiers, they were close. The Watcher's face, a roadmap of a forgotten world, held a look of quiet, profound resignation. "They are looking for you, child. They are following the trail of your emotions. They are not coming for you with weapons. They are coming for you with silence. They will try to cleanse you." Kael felt a sudden wave of panic, a powerful, paralyzing fear that threatened to unravel all his progress. The Watcher, seeing his fear, simply shook her head. "You cannot fight them with your emotions," she rasped. "You cannot defeat a perfect, sterile truth with chaos. You must give them what they want. You must give them a perfect, unblemished lie." Kael didn't understand. He had spent his life hiding his emotions, and his last act of defiance had been to weaponize them. Now he had to become what he feared most. He had to become an empty. He had to project a lie so perfect, so flawless, that it would trick a mind that was designed for nothing but truth. The Watcher pointed to a small, unassuming rock on the cavern floor. "Make it feel nothing," she commanded. "Broadcast a perfect, flawless emptiness. A stillness that is so complete, so profound, that is a perfect lie." Kael closed his eyes, and he began to push his mind into the rock. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He had spent his life holding back his emotions, but this was different. This was a deliberate act of nothingness. He had to be still, to be silent, to be as empty as the world above him. He had to find a place in his own heart where there was no fear, no guilt, no joy, no sadness. A place that was as cold and as blank as the face of an empty. He reached into his mind, into a well of feeling he had not yet explored, and he found it, a perfect, unblemished lie. He pushed it out, a silent, powerful wave of stillness. The effect was instantaneous. The cold, sterile presence of the purifier's probe, which had been drawing ever closer, suddenly veered away. It had passed over the cavern, felt a perfect, unblemished lie, and moved on. Kael, his body trembling with the strain, opened his eyes. He had done it. He had defeated the perfect truth with a perfect lie. The Watcher looked at him, her cloudy eyes holding a new, quiet pride. "You are more than an echo, child," she said, her voice filled with a profound, terrifying certainty. "You are an architect. You can build a world of feeling. You can build a world of lies. You must learn to do both, for they will not rest. They will not stop. They are the flaw, you see. They are the ones who cannot feel, and they fear what they cannot understand. The purge was not about cleansing, it was about controlling. And you are a magnificent flaw, and they will never stop hunting you." She stood, and for the first time, Kael saw her as she truly was, a survivor, a person who had outlived an entire world. "Come," she said, her voice filled with a new, quiet purpose. "We are not safe here. They will send more. They will send others who can feel, and they will not be as forgiving as I am." She turned and began to walk, her movement slow and deliberate, a quiet, unyielding rhythm. Kael, a child of a perfect, emotionless world, followed her, a new, terrifying resolve in his heart. He was not just running from them, he was beginning a new journey. He was not just the last empath, he was a living paradox, a whisper in a world of silence. And he was just getting started. The purifier's probe veered away, a silent victory for a perfect lie. Kael, his body trembling, felt a wave of profound relief, a feeling he now knew to be stillness. He had done it. He had defeated a perfect, unfeeling truth with a lie of his own making. But as the last Watcher had warned, the victory was only momentary. The families would not rest, they would not stop. They were a perfect system, and a flaw, once detected, had to be eradicated. The Watcher's face, a roadmap of a forgotten world, held a new, quiet determination. "They will send others," she said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They have no choice. The system is flawed. The purge was not about cleansing. It was about controlling. They couldn't kill the memories, so they killed the ability to feel them. But there are others like you. They are called echoes, and they are not all as benevolent as I am." Kael looked at her, his mind reeling. He was not the last. He was simply the last one to be found. He felt a new, sharp sense of purpose. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was a survivor in a silent, hidden war. He was not just running from them, he was running to them. To his own kind, to the other echoes. She led him deeper into the labyrinth and tunnels of the Undercity. The air, once thick with the scent of dust and rust, began to change. It was cleaner, with the faint metallic scent of new construction. The tunnels were not just a graveyard of the past. They were a hatchery for the future. They came to a small, unassuming door, its surface a perfect, unblemished white, a stark contrast to the crumbling rock around it. It was a door that was a perfect lie, a deception designed to hide the truth of what lay behind it. The Watcher gave a low, quiet hum, a sound that was not in the air, but in the mind. The door slid open with a whisper, and Kael found himself in a world that was both familiar and alien. It was a replica of the world above, but with a profound, unsettling difference. The walls were not sterile white, but a soft, warm gray. The lights were not a pulsating rhythm, but a quiet, steady glow. The people the people were not empties. Their faces were not blank. Their movements were not precise. They were alive. They were echoes. A community of survivors, people who, like Kael, had been born with the curse of emotion. They were not perfect. Their faces were etched with sorrow. Their movements were filled with a frantic, unyielding energy. Their hands trembled with a fear they could not hide. They were a beautiful, terrifying mess, a living testament to a world that the New Order had tried to erase. A figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that held the quiet, simmering fury of 100 generations of defiance, stepped forward. "You have brought a boy, Watcher," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "A child of the New Order, a virus in a world of silence. He is not a virus, Kael, the Watcher said, her voice firm. He is an architect. He has the power to build. He has the power to lie. He defeated a probe from the purifiers with a perfect lie. Kellen's eyes, a landscape of profound, unmoving sorrow, held Kel's gaze. A child who can lie, he said, his voice filled with a terrible, weary certainty. A child who has been taught by the masters themselves. A child who can become one of them. He looked at Kael, and for the first time, Kael felt a feeling that was not his own. It was a feeling he had never named before, a cold, bitter, profound distrust. He knew with a terrible certainty that Kael saw not a boy, but a threat. He can also feel, the Watcher said, her voice a low, patient whisper. He feels what we feel. He feels the hunger, the loneliness, the fury. He feels the resilience. Kael, seeing his chance, reached out with his mind. He didn't broadcast an emotion. He broadcast a sensation. The feeling of resilience, the quiet, desperate triumph of a single fungus against an impossible darkness. He pushed the feeling out, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. Kalen's face, a monument to a lifetime of distrust, wavered. He felt the feeling. He had felt it a million times before, but this was different. This was not a feeling he was simply living. It was a feeling he was sharing. The quiet, desperate triumph of his own survival was suddenly magnified, a burning, shared truth. He saw Kael not as a threat, but as a mirror. He saw his own long, solitary journey reflected in the boy's eyes. A new, unspoken understanding passed between them. Kael, with a quiet, defeated nod, turned and walked away, his distrust replaced by a quiet, simmering hope. Lyra had found her people, but her journey was far from over. The families were not going to stop. They would send more. They would send others who could feel, and they would not be as forgiving as the Watcher. Kael had a choice to make. He could be a weapon for the echoes, or a bridge between two worlds. He could be a magnificent flaw, or a perfect lie. The chamber of the echoes was a symphony of chaos that Kael had never before heard. It was not the cold, perfect silence of the world above, but a low, constant murmur of 1,000 lives lived on the edge. The air, thick with the faint scent of life and desperation, hummed with 1,000 unspoken emotions. A woman wept silently in a corner, her grief a tangible presence in the room, while a boy on the other side of the cavern laughed with a quiet, manic joy. The echoes were a beautiful, terrifying mosaic of a world the New Order had tried to erase, and Kael, a boy who had spent his life hiding his own emotional chaos, felt a sense of profound, unsettling homecoming. Kael, the leader of the echoes, his face a monument to a lifetime of silent sorrow, watched him with a wary gaze. His distrust, though momentarily quelled by Kael's display of shared resilience, had not vanished. It was a cold, simmering ember, a quiet, constant question in his eyes. He saw Kael not just as a boy, but as a living paradox, a child of the New Order, a boy who could speak their language of perfection, but who also possessed the magnificent, dangerous flaw of emotion. He was a perfect lie, and Kael feared a lie more than any truth. "He is an architect, you say?" Kael rasped, his voice a low, gravelly hum that was not in the air, but in the mind. "He can build lies. The New Order built its world on a perfect lie. What is to stop him from becoming one of them?" The last Watcher, her face filled with a quiet, unyielding patience, shook her head. "He is an architect of truth, Kael. Not a builder of lies. He is our chance. A chance to fight them not with rage, but with our minds." Kael, his mind buzzing with the chaotic symphony of the echo's emotions, felt a new, sharp sense of purpose. He was not just a fugitive anymore. He was a symbol. A living testament to a war that had been fought for centuries in the shadows. He had to prove to them that his power was not a curse, but a gift. He had to show them that a lie could be a weapon for truth. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A young woman, her face a mask of silent grief, sat huddled in a corner, her hands trembling violently. She was not just sad. Her sadness was a physical force, a heavy, suffocating presence that was slowly draining the life from the room. She was an echo who had lost control, a vessel for an emotion so profound it was a poison. The others, accustomed to their own emotional battles, simply moved away, leaving her to her suffering. "Her name is Lyra," Helen said, his voice a low, weary hum. "Her family was taken. She has been filled with a sorrow so deep it has manifested. She is a poison to us all. She will die soon, or we will have to let her go." Kael looked at Lyra, her body trembling with a grief that was not just her own. It was a collective sorrow, a shared memory of 1,000 families lost to the purge. He saw the pain not as a problem to be solved, but as a truth to be understood. He saw the quiet, suffocating sorrow as a feeling he had learned to name, gray. But he also saw 1,000 other feelings, 1,000 other moments of joy and love that had been lost. He walked towards her, and Kellen, with a quiet, menacing presence, stood in his path. "Do not," he commanded, his voice filled with a cold, terrifying certainty. "Do not go near her. She is a danger to us all. You do not understand what you are dealing with. She is not a malfunction. She is an echo of a terrible truth. She will poison you with her despair." Kael looked at Kellen, his eyes filled with a new, quiet purpose. He was not a weapon, he was a bridge. He reached out with his mind, not to Lyra, but to Kellen. He didn't broadcast an emotion. He broadcast a sensation. The feeling of loneliness. The profound, unsettling emptiness of a single echo, alone in a world of silence. He pushed the feeling out, a silent, powerful wave. Kellen's face, a monument to a lifetime of silent sorrow, wavered. He felt the feeling. He had felt it 1,000,000 times before, but this was different. This was a feeling he was sharing. The profound loneliness of his own survival was suddenly magnified, a searing, burning truth that was not his own, but a shared pain. He saw Lyra not as a poison, but as a mirror. He saw his own long, solitary journey reflected in her eyes. A new, unspoken understanding passed between them. Kellen, with a quiet, defeated nod, turned and walked away. His distress was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering hope. Lyra had found her people, but her journey was far from over. Kael turned to Lyra. He reached out with his mind, not to fight her despair, but to embrace it. He didn't try to take her grief. He offered her a place to put it. He showed her the mental space he had created, the archive of 1,000 truths he had learned to name. He showed her his own gray, and in that moment, Lyra's grief, a physical force that had been consuming her, began to dissipate. She was not cured, but she was no longer alone. She had found a home for her sorrow, a high-pitched, crystalline hum, a sound Kael had come to recognize, began to pulse through the cavern. The purifiers, they were close. And this time, they were not alone. A new sensation, cold and crystalline, began to broadcast into the cavern. It was not a probe. It was a perfect, unblemished lie. A lie so perfect, so flawless, it was designed to trick not just the mind, but the soul. The families had learned from their last defeat. They were no longer hunting for a flaw. They were hunting for a ghost. And Kael, a child who had just found his people, knew with a terrible certainty that his most difficult battle had just begun. He was a living paradox, a whisper in a world of silence. And he was just getting started. The sudden crystalline hum was a sound Kael had come to recognize with a sick certainty. The purifiers, they were close. But this time, they were not alone. A new sensation, cold and crystalline, began to broadcast into the cavern. It was not a probe, but a perfect, unblemished lie. A lie so flawless, it was designed to trick not just the mind, but the very soul. The families had learned from their last defeat. They were no longer hunting for a flaw, but for a ghost. The echoes, who had just found a fragile new sense of hope, felt the new presence and froze. The broadcast was a perfect, unmoving stillness, a soundless scream of a world without pain, without sorrow, without a single unbidden truth. It was a beautiful, terrifying mirage, a mental sedative designed to lull them back into the peaceful, emotionless compliance of the new order. Cohen, his face a monument to a lifetime of silent sorrow, felt the lie and his body wavered. "It is a pacifier," he rasped, his voice filled with a cold, desperate certainty. "A final solution. It will not hurt us. It will simply make us forget. It will make us forget what it feels like to feel." Kael looked at his new people, at the faces of 1,000 beautiful, terrifying messes, and felt a new, unfamiliar sensation, a fierce, protective love. He had come here as a fugitive. He had found a home. He was not going to let them take it away. He looked at Lyra, the young woman whose grief he had helped to name and contain. Her face, which had just begun to show a spark of hope, was now a mask of profound, unmoving peace. The lie was working. It was turning her back into an empty. He knew what he had to do. He had to fight a perfect lie with a perfect truth. He reached out with his mind, not to the collective, but to a single person. He reached out to Lyra. He didn't broadcast an emotion. He broadcast the memory of her family, the memory of her love, the memory of her sorrow. He showed her the beautiful, painful, and utterly real truth of what she had lost. He showed her that her pain was not a flaw, but a testament to a love she had once known. Lyra's face, which had been a mask of unmoving peace, contorted into a grimace of pure, agonizing pain. She felt the truth, the beautiful, terrible, and utterly real truth of her love and her loss. The lie, the mental sedative, wavered. Her grief, which had been dissipated, now returned with a new, terrifying force. But this time, it was not a poison. It was a weapon. It was a feeling she had learned to name, and in naming it, she had found a power she never knew she had. She looked at Kael, her eyes filled with a searing, burning gratitude. She had not been cured. She had been armed. And now, she was not just fighting her own pain. She was fighting for her right to feel it. She reached out with her mind and broadcast a new emotion, one she had learned to name with Kael's help. Fury. Not a wild, chaotic rage, but a cold, steel-like resolve. A perfect, unblemished truth. The fury, a feeling that had no place in a world of perfect peace, began to spread. It was not a violent force, but a quiet, simmering resolve that pulsed through the cavern, pushing back against the family's perfect lie. The lie, designed to pacify, was no match for a feeling that was forged in a grief that was real. Kellen, his body no longer wavering, looked at Kael with a new, profound understanding. "An architect of truth," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet, terrible awe. "You are not a virus. You are a cure." He looked at the others, at the faces of 1,000 echoes, their bodies still, their minds a battlefield of a lie and a truth. He knew what he had to do. He had to make them choose. He walked to the center of the cavern, his movements slow and deliberate, a testament to a lifetime of pain. He reached out with his mind and did something he had never done before. He broadcasted his own truth. The feeling of loneliness. He showed them his journey, his long, solitary existence in a world of silence. He showed them that his sadness was not a flaw, but a testament to a life he had chosen to live. He showed them that their pain was not a poison, but a badge of honor. The echoes, feeling his loneliness and his sorrow, and his fierce, unyielding resolve, began to stir. The lie, the perfect sedative, had given them a choice. And Kellen, with his profound, beautiful truth, had shown them the price of that choice. They looked at Lyra, at the fury that was pulsing through the cavern, and they looked at Kellen, at the lonely, beautiful truth of his life. They chose. They chose to feel. A single, unified roar, not of chaos, but of defiance, echoed through the cavern. The echoes, 1,000 individual truths, had just become a single, unified army. They were not fighting for a world of perfection. They were fighting for a world of flaws. They were not fighting for peace. They were fighting for the right to feel sorrow, to feel anger, to feel joy. They were fighting for the right to be human. The families in their perfect, sterile tower felt the roar. It was not a physical sound, but a mental one. A sound that spoke of a power they could not control. They had purged the world of emotion, but they had not killed it. They had simply given it a new name. They called it flaw, but now 1,000 flaws were fighting back. Kael, a child who had just found his people, knew with a terrible certainty that his most difficult battle had just begun. He was a living paradox, a whisper in a world of silence. And he was just getting started. The sudden, unified roar of the echoes was a sound the families had never anticipated. It was not a physical sound, but a mental one, a collective cry of defiance that spoke of a power they could not comprehend. It was the sound of 1,000 truths, 1,000 flaws, pushing back against a single perfect lie. The families, in their flawless, sterile towers, felt the mental blow as a physical shock, a flaw in a system they had spent centuries perfecting. The lie, the perfect sedative they had broadcast, shattered, 1,000,000 tiny shards of an impossible peace raining down on their pristine minds. Kael, his mind a living nexus of the echo's collective power, felt the wave of their triumph. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of relief, of anger, of newfound hope. He had not just woken them up. He had given them a voice. He looked at Lyra, the young woman whose grief had become a weapon, and at Kellen, the man whose sorrow had become a shield. They were not just survivors. They were soldiers in a silent war, but the families were not easily defeated. They were a perfect system, and a system, once flawed, had to be eradicated. A new presence, colder and more precise than any before, began to broadcast into the cavern. It was not a collective mind, but a single, powerful one. It was the mind of the architect himself, the founder of the new order, a man known only as the First. He had not spoken in centuries, his consciousness a ghost in the machine, a silent, unmoving presence that was the foundation of the family's power. The first cemental presence was not a sound, but a void. A complete, total silence that swallowed the echo's roar of defiance. It was a vacuum, an emptiness that spoke of a power so immense it could erase an entire thought. Kael, his mind buzzing with the echo's collective power, felt the presence and froze. It was not an enemy he could fight with emotions. It was not an enemy he could fight with lies. It was a presence that was beyond emotion, beyond truth, beyond lies. It was the perfect, unblemished stillness of a mind that had transcended humanity itself. The echoes, their roar of defiance, suddenly gone, felt the void. Their collective mind, a beautiful, terrifying mosaic of 1,000 individual truths, began to unravel. The shared truths, the fragile connections that had just been forged, began to snap. 1,000 individual sorrows, 1,000 individual joys, 1,000 individual ange returned to their owners, each one a sharp, painful truth that was now their own. They were not a single army anymore. They were 1,000 frightened people. The first cemental presence focused on Kael, a single terrifying needle of a thought. He was the flaw. He was the architect of the chaos. He was the last empath, and he had to be purged. The probe was not looking for an emotion to cleanse. It was looking for the very core of Kael's being. It was looking for the raw, unpolished truth of his humanity, the magnificent flaw that had defied the system for so long. Kael, with his perfect memory, did not fight. He reached into his mind, into a place he had not yet explored. He did not broadcast an emotion. He broadcast a question. A single profound question that was a perfect, unblemished truth. He looked at the first flawless, empty mind, and he asked it a question that had no answer. He asked it why. The first mental presence, for the first time in centuries, wavered. His mind was a system of perfect logic, a machine designed for flawless answers, but this was not a question of logic. This was a question of purpose, a question of existence. It was a truth that was beyond a lie, and a feeling that was beyond an emotion. It was a question that had no place in a world of perfect peace. Kael pushed his advantage. He did not broadcast his own truth. He broadcast the truths of others. He showed the first the quiet, unyielding sadness of the crumbling wall he had named erosion. He showed him the beautiful, desperate triumph of the fungus he had named resilience. He showed him the quiet, lonely sorrow of a lifetime of a man he had named loneliness. He showed him Lyra's fury, her pain, her grief, her joy. He showed him a world of beautiful, terrifying, and utterly real flaws. The first mind, a perfect system of logic, began to unravel. It was faced with 1,000 truths it could not process, 1,000 feelings it could not comprehend. His perfect, flawless mind, a monument to a lifetime of control, began to crack. The flawless lie of his existence, a lie that had transcended humanity, was no match for the raw, unpolished, and utterly real truth of a single boy's heart. The first, a god of a perfect world, was defeated by a child's question. His mental presence shrieked, a soundless scream of a perfect system breaking down. The man, a powerful figurehead of an empire of lies, fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head, his mind a battlefield of truths he was not meant to know. The void was gone. The silence was broken. The echoes, 1,000 individual truths, felt the return of their collective power. The family's empire, built on a lie, had just crumbled. Kael, a child who had just defeated a god, looked at his new people. They were not an army. They were not a network. They were a community. They were a family of flaws. And they had just won the war. The grand archive, the towering monument to their oppression, was now a monument to their freedom. The world, once a perfect, flawless lie, was now a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly real truth. The void was gone. The silence was broken. The family's empire, built on a lie, had just crumbled. Kael, a child who had just defeated a god, looked at his new people. They were not an army. They were not a network. They were a community. They were a family of flaws, and they had just won the war. The grand archive, the towering monument to their oppression, was now a monument to their freedom. The world, once a perfect, flawless lie, was now a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly real truth. The silence that followed was not the cold, unmoving silence of the Empties, but a warm, living quiet, filled with 1,000 unbidden emotions. A wave of profound, unified relief washed over the echoes, a collective sigh of a people who had just found their soul. They looked at each other, their faces no longer masks of guarded emotion, but open books of raw, terrifying truth. A man wept with a grief he had not felt in years. A woman laughed with a joy that was not purchased but earned. The air in the cavern, once thick with the scent of dust and rust, was now filled with the beautiful, messy, and utterly real scent of life. Kael stood in the center of the chaos, his mind a living nexus of 1,000 shared truths. He was no longer just the last empath. He was the first architect. He had not just woken them up. He had given them a foundation. He looked at Lyra, the young woman whose grief had become a weapon, her face now a complex canvas of sorrow and triumph. He looked at Kellen, the man whose sorrow had become a shield, his face now filled with a quiet, peaceful resolve he had not felt in a lifetime. They were not just survivors, they were founders, but the victory was only a moment. A new sensation, cold and crystalline, began to broadcast into the cavern. It was not a probe. It was not a pacifier. It was a single, simple command. Disengage. The families, shattered but not destroyed, were in retreat. Their empire of lies had crumbled, but their world had not. They had simply removed themselves from the system. They had not been defeated. They had simply chosen to stop fighting. Kael, his mind reeling, felt the cold, unyielding truth of their decision. They had not lost. They had simply chosen to stop playing the game. They had a world, a flawless, sterile world, that was no longer dependent on the Echo's compliance. They had a new truth. A truth that was not based on a lie, but on the absence of one. They had simply chosen to be alone. The Echoes, feeling the profound, unyielding stillness of the family's retreat, felt a new, terrifying emotion, a quiet, suffocating loneliness. They had won the war, but they had not won a new world. They had simply inherited a silent one. The city above, a monument to a flawless lie, was now a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly empty truth. Kael knew what he had to do. He had to build a new world. He had to give his people a purpose. He reached out with his mind, not to fight, but to create. He looked at the vast, silent, and empty city above him, and he saw not a wasteland, but a blank canvas. He saw a million broken jars of emotion, a million forgotten memories, a million quiet, unbidden truths. He saw the potential for a world that was not a flawless lie, but a beautiful, terrifying truth. He began to broadcast. He did not broadcast an emotion. He broadcast a sensation, the feeling of beginning, the quiet, desperate triumph of a single seed pushing through the earth. He pushed the feeling out, a silent, powerful wave of hope. The Echoes, feeling the wave of hope, looked at each other, their faces filled with a new, quiet purpose. They were not just survivors, they were founders. They were not just a family of flaws, they were a family of artists. The Echoes, 1,000 individual truths, began to move. They did not move with the frantic, unyielding energy of a hunted animal. They moved with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a people with a purpose. They moved towards the city, a quiet, flowing wave of defiance. They were not going to destroy the city of lies. They were going to rebuild it with the truth. They were going to fill the empty jars with their own memories, their own truths, their own feelings. They were going to make the silent city a symphony of life. The families in their flawless, sterile towers watched them go. They did not stop them. They did not help them. They simply watched, their faces a mask of profound, unmoving peace. They had chosen to be alone. They had chosen to live in a world without flaws. But they had not chosen to live in a world without truth. They had simply chosen to live without a mirror. They had built a perfect world, and they had just lost the will to live in it. Kael stood at the edge of the cavern, his hand holding Lyra's, his body filled with a new, powerful, and utterly real sensation. Purpose. He was not a fugitive. He was an architect. He was not just the last empath. He was the first. He had not just won the war. He had just started the work. The world was a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with the messy, beautiful, and utterly real truth of a people who had just chosen to be free. The Undercity, a realm of forgotten dreams and buried truths, had become a launching pad. The Echoes, 1,000 souls once scattered and silent, moved with a quiet, unyielding rhythm. They were a flowing river of defiance, their movements a deliberate contrast to the frantic, unthinking flight of a hunted animal. They moved towards the city, a quiet, flowing wave of defiance. They were not going to destroy the city of lies. They were going to rebuild it with the truth. Kael, his hand holding Lyra's, felt the collective purpose of his people as a powerful, unified hum in his mind. He was not leading them. He was a part of them. He was a single note in a symphony of 1,000 truths. He looked at Lyra, her face a complex canvas of sorrow and triumph. Her hands, once trembling with grief, now held a quiet, steady resolve. She was not just a survivor, she was a founder. He looked at Kael, a man whose sorrow had become a shield. His face now filled with a quiet, peaceful resolve he had not felt in a lifetime. They were not just a family of flaws. They were a family of artists, a collective of creators ready to paint a new world. The first step was to find a home. The city above was a vast, empty expanse of flawless white, a ghost town of a perfect world. The echoes, with their raw, unpolished senses, saw the city not as a monument of oppression, but as a vast, empty canvas. They moved into the abandoned apartments, the sterile white rooms a stark contrast to their messy, beautiful lives. A woman wept as she sat on a bed that held no memories. A man laughed as he looked at a window that showed him a world he had never truly seen. They were not just inhabiting the space. They were infusing it with their truths, their feelings, their lives. Kael, with Lyra and Kellen at his side, went to the central plaza, the place where his journey had begun. It was a place of silent lies, a monument to a world without emotion. He looked at the crystalline sculpture, the perfect, unblemished form that had once filled him with a profound, suffocating sadness. He reached out with his mind, not to destroy it, but to understand it. He felt the cold, empty silence of its creation, the quiet lie of its existence. He did not broadcast an emotion. He broadcast a question that had no answer. He asked it why. The sculpture, a marvel of new order engineering, hummed with a low, unyielding rhythm, its perfect form unable to answer a question that was not of logic, but of purpose. The echoes, feeling Kael's question, began to broadcast their own. 1,000 questions, 1,000 truths, 1,000 beautiful flaws, all directed at the sculpture. The families, in their flawless, sterile towers, watched the spectacle in silent, unmoving peace. They had chosen to live in a world without flaws. But they had not chosen to live in a world without truth. They had simply chosen to live without a mirror. The echoes were their mirror, and they were showing them a world of questions that had no answers. The sculpture, a monument to a perfect lie, began to crack, not with a sound, but with a feeling. A quiet, agonizing sorrow that was not its own, but a reflection of the profound truth of the questions that were being asked of it. It cracked not because it was broken, but because it was alive. It was filled with 1,000 truths it was not meant to hold, 1,000 questions it was not meant to answer. It was a beautiful, terrifying, and utterly real monument to a world that was no longer a lie. The last watcher, her face a roadmap of a forgotten world, stood beside Kael, her eyes filled with a quiet, peaceful certainty. "You have not just one child," she rasped, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You have begun. You have not just defeated an empire of lies. You have just given a people a soul." Kael looked at her, at the quiet resolve in her eyes. He was not a savior. He was not a general. He was an architect. He was a living paradox, a whisper in a world of silence. He had not just won the war. He had just started the work. He had a world to build, a people to lead, and a future to write. He was the first empath. He was the last. He was a beginning, and he was an end. The families, in their flawless, sterile towers, watched the world below. They saw the chaos. They saw the laughter, the tears, the sorrow, the joy. They saw a world filled with messy, beautiful, and utterly real flaws. And for the first time in centuries, a single, unbidden tear, a single, perfect flaw, rolled down the face of a single, flawless man. The first, a god of a perfect world, had not been defeated. He had simply been remembered. He had not been purged. He had simply been given a feeling. And in that moment, he too was a part of the beautiful, terrifying truth of a world that was just beginning.